May 4th, 1535. The sun barely pierces the gray London sky. A muffled crowd stands in eerie silence outside Tyburn, their breath forming mist in the morning chill. All eyes are fixed on a procession emerging from the tower gates. 3 monks, robed in white, emaciated from starvation, barefoot on the rough stones. They are dragged behind horses, bound tightly to hurdles. These men are not thieves, not murderers. They are monks, and they are about to face a death so gruesome, so deliberately sadistic, that it would mark one of the darkest days in King Henry VIII's campaign to break the Catholic Church in England. But how did men of peace, silent, devout hermits, become enemies of the crown? To understand, we must return to the firestorm of political ambition, religious war, and personal obsession that consumed Henry VIII and led to the execution of men who chose silence over submission. In the early 16th century, the Carthusian order was among the most revered monastic communities in England. Isolated, silent, and fiercely ascetic, they lived within the Charterhouse of London, a stone sanctuary just outside the city walls. Their days were spent in solitary prayer, fasting, and manual labor. They had little contact with the outside world, no political ambitions, and even less interest in royal affairs. But history has a cruel way of dragging the quietest souls into the loudest storms. And no storm was more violent than King Henry VIII's battle with Rome. In 1527, Henry, then in his mid-30s, was desperate. He had been married to Catherine of Aragon for nearly 20 years and had only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. No male heir, no future security for the Tudor line. But there was another complication. Henry had fallen madly in love with a cunning lady-in-waiting named Anne Boleyn. His passion burned like wildfire. He was determined to make her his queen, and for that, he needed an annulment. The Pope refused. Catherine, after all, was the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor. Granting Henry's annulment risked war with the most powerful man in Europe. Denied by the Church, Henry made a catastrophic decision. He would separate England from Rome and declare himself supreme head of the Church of England. The Act of Supremacy, passed in 1534, demanded that every subject recognize Henry, not the Pope, as the highest religious authority in the land. Most bent the knee, bishops, lords, even many monks. But in the silence of the London Charterhouse, the Carthusians refused. At their head was Prior John Houghton, a small, soft-spoken man with piercing eyes and an iron will. He had no interest in politics. He believed, simply and devoutly, that Christ's church was universal and indivisible. To recognize the king as its head, in place of the Pope, was heresy. And so, when ordered to sign the oath of supremacy, Houghton refused. Henry did not take the insult lightly. He sent Thomas Cromwell, his chief enforcer and architect of the English Reformation, to deal with the monks. At first, Cromwell tried persuasion. He promised mercy, wealth, protection. But the monks would not betray their conscience. In April 1535, Houghton and 2 other priors, Robert Lawrence and Augustine Webster, were arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. There they were subjected to hunger, cold, and psychological torment. Still, they would not bend. On May 4th, they were dragged from their cells, tied to hurdles, and pulled through the muddy streets to Tyburn. As the monks prayed, the crowd looked on, stunned at what was about to occur. The punishment was the same one given to traitors, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But this execution was not about justice. It was theater, designed to terrify every man, woman, and child who dared put the Pope above the king. Houghton was the first. He was lifted by the neck, hanged until he began to choke, then cut down while still alive. Before the crowd, his abdomen was sliced open. His entrails were pulled out and burned as he watched. Then came the axe, his head severed, his body quartered. The same fate awaited Lawrence and Webster. Their remains were nailed to the gates of London. Their heads, mounted on pikes, were displayed above the entrance of the Charterhouse, where their brothers could see them. But Henry wasn't finished. Over the next year, he targeted the remaining Carthusians who still resisted. Monks were imprisoned in filthy dungeons, deliberately starved over weeks, dying one by one in agony. Others were dragged to execution grounds and butchered in public. By 1537, a total of 18 Carthusians had died for their faith. Their silence, once a mark of humility, had become the most powerful act of defiance. Cromwell's agents believed that the deaths would break the order's resolve, but it had the opposite effect. Whispers of the monks' courage spread across Europe. Even those who supported Henry's reforms began to question the morality of a king who would slaughter holy men simply for remaining loyal to Rome. Behind palace walls, Henry remained unrepentant. To him, the monks were traitors, obstacles to a divine mission, one in which his authority could not be challenged. The church, the law, the very fabric of belief. He would remake it all in his image. But something had changed. The Charter House, once a quiet monastic haven, had become a symbol of holy resistance. The blood of the martyrs stained its stones, and though the order was broken, their memory could not be silenced. The Charter House stood quiet after the deaths of the first martyrs. But it was not peace. It was mourning. The remaining monks lived each day under the shadow of Tyburn's gallows, watching from their cloisters as their brothers' heads decayed above the gate. The message from the crown was unmistakable: obey or die. Some did sign the oath, trembling and broken. But for others, submission was not an option. In the months that followed, Henry's wrath intensified. He dispatched more agents to interrogate the remaining monks. When persuasion failed, starvation followed. 10 monks were locked inside Newgate Prison, a place notorious even in Tudor England for its filth and cruelty. There, they were denied food, given no beds, left in the dark with rats, lice, and disease. They died slowly, some after weeks, some after months. Their final prayers were whispered in a stench-ridden cell beneath the city that had once respected their holiness. Meanwhile, Henry continued to remake the country in his own image. The Pope had excommunicated him. Europe watched in horror as a Christian king turned executioner. But Henry didn't care. He had his new queen now, and Boleyn, crowned in a lavish ceremony, her belly already swelling with what he believed would be a male heir. But the child would be a girl, and, like Catherine before her, would fall out of favor the moment her womb failed to serve the dynasty. Back at the Charter House, the resistance continued. Dom William Exmew and Dom Sebastian Newdigate, both respected senior monks, refused the oath. Newdigate, once a friend of the king, had even dined with Henry in happier times. Now he was seized, shackled to a post in the tower, and kept standing for 13 days straight, day and night, without rest, in an attempt to break him. When that failed, he was sentenced to death. On June 19, 1535, Exmew, Newdigate, and Humphrey Middlemore were taken to Tyburn. As with the first 3 martyrs, they were dragged through the streets and subjected to the full ritual of execution. Hanged until barely conscious, disemboweled alive, castrated, and finally beheaded and quartered. Once again, their heads were displayed for all to see. And once again, silence fell over London. A silence that did not mean approval, but fear. Even those who supported the Reformation privately recoiled. Was this what religious reform looked like? A trail of mutilated corpses? Holy men butchered like animals? But Henry pushed on. Between 1536 and 1540, he began the dissolution of the monasteries, a campaign that would strip the church of its wealth and land and place it all in the hands of the crown. Hundreds of abbeys, priories, and convents were looted, ransacked, and dismantled. Thousands of monks and nuns were evicted, forced to abandon centuries of tradition. Ancient libraries were burned, relics destroyed, sacred places converted into estates for Henry's favorites. The Charter House, too, would be dissolved, but not before more monks would die. One by one, those who had resisted, quietly, peacefully, were hunted, imprisoned, and erased. By 1537, 18 Carthusian monks had been executed, starved, or otherwise martyred. The order in England, once a shining light of contemplative prayer, was obliterated. And yet their deaths stirred something deeper. The European Catholic world watched with growing alarm. The Pope called the monks saints. Pamphlets spread across the continent telling of their calm courage at the scaffold. Priests in France, Italy, and Spain invoked their names during Mass. They became a symbol of defiance, not just to Henry, but to the rising tide of absolutist rulers who sought to place the state above the soul. Even in England, quiet resistance smoldered. Not everyone who stayed silent had agreed. Many simply feared the fate they'd seen play out at Tyburn. But the blood had already soaked into the soil. Ironically, the very queen for whom all of this had begun, Anne Boleyn, would herself fall victim to Henry's wrath. In 1536, after failing to produce a son, and was accused of adultery, incest, and treason, charges fabricated by Cromwell and the king's increasingly paranoid court. She was arrested, tried in a sham tribunal, and sentenced to death. On May 19th, she was taken to the Tower Green and beheaded with a French sword. The same king who had destroyed the monks in her name now destroyed her. Anne's execution shook the court. If even a queen could be discarded so easily, what hope did anyone else have? In the years that followed, Henry VIII became more isolated, more tyrannical. He would marry 4 more times, execute more friends, more advisors. Even Thomas Cromwell, his chief architect of the Reformation, would eventually be sent to the scaffold. But the Charterhouse monks never faded from memory. Their deaths were recorded in letters, whispered in secret chapels, carved into hidden walls. Their names were preserved by Catholics who held underground masses during later persecutions. And centuries later, long after the fires of Henry's rage had cooled, the Church would recognize them for what they were: martyrs. In 1886, Pope Leo XIII beatified the Carthusian martyrs. In 1970, 40 of the English and Welsh martyrs, many of them monks, were canonized as saints by Pope Paul VI. Today, their memory lives on not in palaces or cathedrals, but in the quiet persistence of faith, in the refusal to yield, in the power of silence to defy the roar of tyranny. King Henry VIII died in 1547, obese, tormented, and paranoid. His once proud legacy forever stained by his cruelty. But the monks he tried to erase, their story is still told, not because they fought with swords, but because they would not lie, because they would not name a man head of God's church, because they chose death over compromise. In an age of violence and ambition, it was not armies or kings who left the deepest mark, but men in robes, hands bound, lips sealed, who died for a truth they would not betray.